You know The Wild Robot was a book before it was a movie, right? And there are 2 more books in the series that are out right now that you can read? Good. But did you also know where the author-illustrator Peter Brown got the idea for the book? And what that process was like, taking it from idea to finished copy? Lucky for you, Peter Brown shared that story on his blog, and I'm sharing it with you today. Hi, I'm Kathy Ellen, a mama, reader, writer, teacher, and Ninja Warrior athlete who is so excited for the Wild Robot movie. I read the books before I read them to my oldest, then read all of them with her. We've been looking for any and all info on the Wild Robot, which is how we found this. An excellent blog post detailing the whole process of making the book. I'll share the highlights with you here and link it in the description if you want to check out the whole thing. The story of the Wild Robot starts in 2008 when Peter was busy making another book, a picture book called The Curious Garden. It's a great read aloud about a boy who discovers nature growing in the most unlikely of places. The book ends with nature taking over. We absolutely love the art and the story of The Curious Garden, so I was happy to hear that his idea for the Wild Robot came alongside working on The Curious Garden. While making that book, he spent time making sketches like this. I love how nature is taking over and spilling out through all of these unlikely places and very developed and industrial looking places. This got him thinking about unnatural things living in surprising places, which led to a few sketches like this one. I love how striking it is with the sun, the shape of the tree, and the robot just standing there. It makes you wonder what is the story behind this image. And while he was looking at this sketch of a robot in a tree, a question popped into his mind. What would an intelligent robot do in the wilderness? He kept working on The Curious Garden, but that question stuck in his mind. He jotted down notes about robots and drew robots in trees, and he started studying science fiction. Here are some of the books that inspired him. Do you see any that you've read? Where does the word robot come from anyway? Peter shares that it comes from a 1920s science fiction play by Carol Capek. The play is called RUR, which stands for Rossum's Universal Robots. Rossum sounds familiar. In the play, the robots realize they don't need their human masters, so why not rise up and destroy humanity? But Peter knew he didn't want to tell a story like that. He wanted to tell a robot nature story. Speaking of nature, check out some nonfiction books that inspired him. You've really got to read a lot if you want to be a good writer. He was also studying great middle grade books, animal behavior, and artificial intelligence. Side note, everyone should read middle grade books. They are excellent. And here's a photo of some of the middle grade novels that inspired him. Do you see any you've read? Raise your hand if you read Hatchet when you were in 4th grade too. In 2012, 4 years later, he returned to that question we talked about earlier. What would an intelligent robot do in the wilderness? That's when he invented Roz, short for Rossum, inspired by the play we talked about earlier. And he started imagining how she'd handle life in the wilderness. There were a few things he thought about a lot when it came to Roz's design. He wanted her to be humanoid, with a head, arms, and legs, so readers could relate to her more. She had to be strong and intelligent, but also vulnerable. Again, so readers could relate to her more. The more readers relate to the main character, the more they'll like the book. And she had to be able to learn so the story could move forward. Now, what about her gender? If you've listened this long, you've heard me talking about Roz using she, her pronouns, since that's the way she's referred to in the book. But that wasn't always the case. Peter Brown originally considered using it, but that pronoun made it so he didn't feel such a strong connection with Roz as a character. He considered inventing a pronoun or using a gender-neutral pronoun as well, but finally took a hard look at Roz's personality and how others would see her, and decided she would be female. Check out these early sketches of Roz. Some of them look very similar to what she looks like in the finished book. I really love the one where she is stepping out of the frame, and I love that we can see that he was playing around with her exact shape and how tiny changes really make a difference in her character and how it pops off the page. Okay, that's the robot part. So how about the nature part? He set it in the future to explain the existence of intelligent robots like Roz and knew that she would have to encounter a lot of nature. How did he come up with the island that Roz eventually calls home? He started by imagining the future created by climate change and sea levels rising. He guessed that many animals that weren't used to living with each other would seek higher ground, and that some of this higher ground would eventually turn into islands. This leads to the setting in the book being an island that is filled with many different plants and animals. I love that he thought so much about this. Honestly, when I started reading the book, I was so absorbed in the story that I didn't even think about it. Once he had the setting of the island and Roz's character design down, he started story mapping the story, which he does with his picture books too. It looks a little like this. Check out all the different connections and the way things could go. I love how everything is down on one page, so those connections can be seen really easily. He spent a year on this, deciding what to keep and what to toss. All the while, he was trying to answer questions like this. How might a robot become wild? Do robots have anything in common with wildlife? What kinds of lessons could Roz learn from a tree, a storm, or an opossum? And why is Roz on an island in the first place? I love that these were some of his driving questions. Once he had the story map all done, it was time to write. But he was nervous. Remember, he had written and illustrated picture books for children. Typically, those run from 32 to 40 pages total. The Wild Robot is a chapter book, so it's a lot more writing and a lot more story. He said he procrastinated by making these writing rules. You're not a poet, just tell the story plainly. I love this one, especially coming from picture books where the limited word count almost forces stories to become poetry. While poetic language is nice to read, it's not a requirement in any book. Keep Roz mysterious by writing in the third person. Have you ever noticed that when reading a book where the character is talked about in third person that you feel a little bit of distance from them? Third person would be something like this. Roz looked around the island. It looked strange to her. If we try those sentences in first person, they'd sound like this. I looked around the island. It looked strange to me. See how you automatically feel closer to the character when it's first person? I love that Roz is written in third person. Make the chapters as short as possible. I can imagine this was a great way to get a chapter done and eventually an entire book done, especially since he wasn't used to writing long fiction. As a reader who has read this aloud and loves ending on chapters, I appreciate this rule a lot. Work with symmetry and repetition to mirror robots and nature. Repetition in children's books is so awesome. It gets the reader into the story easily and gives them something to expect, which can make them feel very comfortable with the story too. I'd argue that this rule is a bit of poetry. Give the narrator a conversational voice, especially during slow scenes. I noticed this right away and appreciated it. Because of the nature of the story, we don't have a lot of dialogue for a pretty long time. And sometimes books without too much dialogue are really difficult for kids to focus on and engage with. But the voice of the narrator in this book is really soothing and engaging, so that wasn't a problem. Understand the motivation behind each of Roz's actions. I love that these are conveyed through the book. It makes for some very funny and heartfelt moments. A robot would always have a reason for their actions, so it's a good way to make sure Roz stays in character as well. Now that he had his rules and his sketches and his story map, he drove off to a cabin in the woods and started writing. Check out this draft that he wrote in Scrivener. This is the same program I use to write a lot of my scripts, including this one. He said it took him more than a year to finish the first draft of The Wild Robot, and even though it was really rough, Little Brown and Company signed it in July 2014, meaning it would become a published book. But he had to finish it first. His friend and editor Alvina Ling gave him her notes, and he kept those in his mind as he got back to writing. In the next year and a half, he rewrote the entire story, the entire thing. Can you imagine? Did you know in the first draft, Roz was a soldier and that she arrived on the island via a plane crash? He kept trying again, story mapping again, bringing in more research, and he still felt like the story was moving in the wrong direction. He decided to simplify everything. The characters, the plot, the writing. He made it all simpler, and it started shaping itself into the story that we know and love today. He said it became less science fiction and more fable, leaning more on metaphor and philosophy. I agree completely. I love how simple the story is and how profound that makes it. It feels like a true classic in the making to me. The cool part about Peter Brown being the author and the illustrator means he got to work a lot on the book's design too. He worked with creative director Dave Kaplan, and they made decisions about the art on the jacket and the case cover. They picked what kind of paper to use and what fonts, and planned out where each and every illustration would go. Here's a sample of what it looked like when they were trying to figure out how to put the illustrations into the book so it made sense as a finished version. Check out these different sketches of the cover as well, and look at the final cover design. Did you know that he hand lettered the front cover, spine, and title page? P.S. The title page is like right when you first open the book and it says the title and the author again. Often it's a spot that writers and illustrators will sign. Then his editor told him it was time to print the advanced reader copies. Those are early copies of a book that are sometimes unfinished. They go out to reviewers and booksellers to get them excited about the book before it officially comes out, so they're ready to recommend it when it does come out. He needed to finish the cover and as much of the interior art as he could, so he could get ready for these to be printed, as well as tighten up the text. There wasn't much time, but he did his best. Arcs were printed in July of 2015. They are paperback because they don't want to spend a ton of money on the production of these They just want people to learn about the book ahead of time. But like they say on them, not everything was final. Also, if you're counting, this is about 7 years after he came up with the idea. 7 years, and the book is not officially published yet. The book got its first official review in November of 2015, and it was a starred review. A starred review stands for excellence in writing and shows that a book is of high quality. This really helps librarians and teachers and booksellers learn about books and sometimes be able to pick ones to have in their library, classroom, or store. And that was just from the ARC. Imagine what they would think when it was all done. Spoiler alert, it got a lot of starred reviews and won some awards too. But remember, at this point, the book wasn't done. Peter had to look closely at every word. He rewrote entire chapters and even changed the names of some of the characters. Plus, he was also drawing up a storm. And if you know the book, literally, there are storms that happened in this book that he had to draw. Then it was time for the first pass pages. Any changes from now on would be relatively minor and written out on printouts with pencil. Why? It was easier for everyone to keep track of the changes if they all lived in one physical document. The one document to rule them all. Check out these first pass pages. They look pretty messy to me. That doesn't look like minor alterations. Peter then shared that the last 6 months of the process were pretty chaotic. He reworked the text and created the final art while not getting a lot of sleep. I'm glad that Peter had so much success from this book and that the movie will be so successful too, because sacrificing sleep is hard. I'm a parent of 2 young kids, so I know about that sacrifice. He really wanted the illustrations to set the tone, not tell the entire story, so he wanted to keep them relatively simple and moody. Do you know how many illustrations are in the book? 65. That is a lot of work. Here's a few of the final interior illustrations. I love how they're in black and white, but they're still so expressive. And here's what the final illustration looks like dropped into the book file, which eventually would go to the printer and become the book we know. Next up, the book jacket was reviewed. Look at all of those colors used on it. It's so vibrant, especially that sun. The interior art was reviewed as well, and they proofed it on the actual paper stock that would be in the book. Sadly, things took a tragic turn on December 25th, 2015, when his editor Alvina's husband died after a long battle with cancer. Of course, everyone was devastated, and his editor took a leave of absence. Though it was hard to keep his motivation up, his publisher needed him to finish the book, and he did. The last revisions went out on January 12th, 2016, and a month later, this final copy showed up. Peter ends this with the description of this book that he worked so hard on. He says, "The Wild Robot is the story of Rosam Unit 7134, a robot who wakes up for the very first time to find that she's alone on a remote, wild island. Roz doesn't know how she got there or where she came from. She only knows that she wants to stay alive. And by robotically studying her environment, she learns everything she needs to know. She learns how to move through the wilderness, how to avoid danger. She even learns how to communicate with the animals. But the most important lesson Roz learns is that kindness can be a survival skill. And she uses kindness to develop friends and a family and a peaceful life for herself until her mysterious past catches up with her." Remember the question he led with that got him thinking about this being a good idea? He asked, what would an intelligent robot do in the wilderness? His final answer, after the 8-year process of turning this idea into a story, into a book, she'd make the wilderness her home. I hope you enjoyed this look at the behind the scenes process of making The Wild Robot into a book. I know it's made me appreciate the story a lot more and will help me appreciate the movie a lot more too. What's one thing you learned from this that totally surprised you? I can't believe Roz used to be a soldier in an earlier draft. I really can't imagine her as one. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep working on your kindness because it is a survival skill.